Crystal Dynamics knocked it out of the park with Soul Reaver on the PS1, and so with that success, it was inevitable that more games would follow. Everybody knows and celebrates Soul Reaver 2 and Defiance, but not many gush about today's entry into the series. The red-headed vampire stepchild of the franchise, and a game whose narrative required changes to be made to the whole series timeline so that the pieces could fit. This is Blood Omen 2. Let's look at the circumstances that brought us Kain's second outing as a protagonist and a steampunk Nosgoth. You know what I'm gonna say next, right? This is a deep dive into elements of the Legacy of Kain series. There will be spoilers. Also, check out the rest of the Legacy of Kain videos. Give them a like and maybe subscribe, it helps a lot. Normally, I'd start by giving you a detailed history of the development, the inspirations behind the story and dialogue style, and generally an overview of the production and its challenges. But can't do much of that with Blood Omen 2, as there is very little known about its development history, but I'll do my best with what's generally known and what I've been able to piece together. Prior to the release of Soul Reaver, there were already plans within Crystal Dynamics for there to be 2 series in the overall Legacy of Kain saga. The first series will be in the future of Nosgoth and its Soul Reaver. The second will be a continuation of Blood Omen, featuring Kain as he went on adventures and eventually create the empire we see in Soul Reaver. Considering Blood Omen 2 released as the 4th game in the series after Soul Reaver 2, it might surprise you to learn that it went into development while Soul Reaver was still in production prior to its release. Unfortunately for Blood Omen 2, the success of Soul Reaver meant its sequel got the higher priority and its development was fast-tracked, which likely resulted in a reduction of resources for the Blood Omen sequel, and by resources I mean people. I don't have sources to confirm this, but as both someone who's heard stories of shifting priorities in game development, and someone who is a software developer and has been moved across projects because one is more important, I am fairly certain that this is what befell Blood Omen 2. Leaving most of the development in the hands of a very small group of people. It's common knowledge that a different team of that of Soul Reaver developed Blood Omen 2, without Amy Hennig being involved in any way. In fact, the only collaboration between the two teams was early on to ensure there was consistency in terms of in-game art, likely on the designer for the Hilden and maybe Janos Audron. Speaking of art, for a long time many thought Blood Omen 2 had been a different game that got the Blood Omen name slapped on it. Essentially what Silicon Knights thought Soul Reaver was. This was due to the fact that aesthetically, many elements of Blood Omen 2 are similar, if not identical, to other works that artist Steve Ross was involved in prior to the game, especially a cancelled sequel for the Sega Genesis game Shakan, the Forever Man, in which enemies bore the broken Ankh symbol used by the Sarafan in Blood Omen 2, and an FPS called Sirens, where the bad guys, daemons or demons, and their architecture and visual motifs bear a striking likeness to the Hilden. Not to mention there are elements of Siren's premise and locations that also appear in Blood Omen 2, the Hilden City at the end being principal among them. While Soul Reaver and Beyond used the Gex 2 engine, Blood Omen 2 used a completely new one, built from the ground up just for Blood Omen 2, though based on an existing one used for a racing game called Mad Dash Racing. Blood Omen 2's aesthetics were inspired by Victorian era London and other European cities at the turn of the 20th century and steampunk fiction, in particular the French film The City of Lost Children. In terms of writing, screenwriter Carol Wolfe was brought in to work on the script. According to an interview with the Ancients Den, many of the scenes were already written, a first draft if you will, and Wolfe's job was to take them and change the dialogue to feel more archaic. At some point though, it seems that instead of providing a first draft, the designer simply told her what a scene was about and she wrote the dialogue for it. But unlike her work on Defiance's script, where Amy Hennig would review Wolfe's work and ask for adjustments if they didn't fit the story or characters, there didn't seem to be someone above her to make sure things were consistent in Blood Omen 2. Lastly, this was another Legacy of Kain game that benefited from the collaboration between Kurt Harland and Jim Hedges, and the adaptive music they created for Soul Reaver and of course, Soul Reaver 2. Compared to other Legacy of Kain titles, Blood Omen 2 has a much larger voice cast, though familiar names will be Simon Templeman as Kain, Paul Lukather as Vorador, and René Auberjonois as Janos Audron. Unfortunately, most of the other actors are frankly wasted on characters that barely have any screen time, so it's no surprise that very much every member of the cast pulled double duty in voicing every other minor NPC. Blood Omen 2 released 6 months after Soul Reaver 2 and received mixed to positive reviews, and in terms of sales was very much on par with Soul Reaver 2. around 500,000 units sold. Its status within the fandom is divisive. Some appreciate it, others pan it. I am more on the latter group. I don't like this game. Some of my issues with it are as a Legacy of Kain entry, but most are just as a game, as a collection of pieces that I feel were not put together particularly well. But with that said, it's time to explore Nosgoth anew and talk about the story of Blood Omen 2. Blood Omen 2 opens with Kain tossing and turning in bed, his nightmares a dramatic summary of events. Kain striding confidently away from the pillars as they collapse behind him. In fact, say goodbye to the pillars. That's the last time you'll see them or even hear about them in the entire game. Next scene shows Kain among a group of vampires, Vordor strangely among them. After all, he got decapitated in Blood Omen. A difficult condition to recover from, I hear, even for a vampire. He and Kain look over a map and plot out the conquest of Nosgoth with a montage of razed cities, until they reach the fortified city of Meridian, where a new Sarafan order stands in their way. A Sarafan order that doesn't use any of the historical iconography of the original one, and is led by the Sarafan Lord, who couldn't look more alien. He's stone gray, has green fire around his head, and has four-fingered, pointy claw-like hands. The Defiance made this guy Hashak geek, and in a certain way, Blood Omen 2 implies it is, but it's not confirmed outright, and there aren't any lines of dialogue that set it in stone. And that brings up an important point. Blood Omen 2 does not offer any explanation for its more surprising elements. Things were added as if it were the first title in a series, so everything was meant to be explored at a later time in a future game. That game ended up being Defiance, and Soul Reaver 2. We see Kain's armies march towards the Sarafan, and if you look at Kain's forces, they're all identical. And I'm not nitpicking that. What I'm nitpicking is that the model used belongs to a boss character. One that has personal beef with Kain, bad blood if you will. And yet his appearance is made instantly generic and forgettable. But we'll talk more about him when we get to him. Kain stands overlooking the battlefield, with another of those clone soldiers by his side along with two unique vampires we'll meet soon enough. Kain does battle with the Sarafan Lord and gets his butt whooped, falling into a coma for 200 years, waking up to find a vampire lady in a purple bikini looking over him. This is Uma, Vordor's agent, and in a very forced way, something of a love interest for Kain. She explains how much time has passed and asks him how much he remembers, to which the vampire tells her he can't remember much, that he only sees pieces of the past.
My mind was in fragments like shattered glass.
He does remember his own name and, of course, his nature. They have a very tense conversation about their goals, with Uma directly telling him the Cabal, the vampire resistance, expects Kain's collaboration in fighting the Sarafan, including the Sarafan's vampire allies. Kain doesn't trust her words, and he warns that once before he played a pawn and it didn't end well. For a guy with fragmented memories and amnesia, he sure does remember things very clearly, doesn't he? Uma assures him this is more of a partnership, that there are no hidden agendas, and once they win, Kain can resume his conquest. If you win, we all win is the party line, which of course will prove to be a lie. Not to mention, she says the Sarafan know their faces. But Kain is ancient history, so he has a better chance to operate throughout Meridian. This will also prove to be something of an inconsistent element in the story. And that is one of the major issues with the script, inconsistency. Remember that, it'll come up. It already has, in fact. Let's keep score. But with regards to the enemies, Kain's attitude is, well, let me at him, bro. A very strange choice in characterization. Kain has never been dumb. In Blood Omen, if he needed help, he sought it. If he needed allies, he went to look for them. If he had to show restraint, he did. So a recently awoken Kain, someone who has fragmented memories and someone who, as he said, remembers being a vampire, would know better. And this is just one of many instances where Kain is written to seemingly abandon reason in favor of dumb pride and bravado. Kain is better than that, even this early in his history. Then our game begins, and it's gotta be said, for all the faults Blood Omen 2 has, Kain looks amazing. A great evolution of his original Blood Omen design. His skin and hair ashen and having that scar from his assassination. He looks impressive, though I'm not a fan of the leather S&M gear he sports for the first chunk of the game. In any case, Uma guides Kain into this new world, this new more advanced Nosgoth, in total 400 years after the end of Blood Omen. The technological level has increased by leaps and bounds, and he finds himself not in a small village, but a bustling metropolis. More specifically, in the slums of said metropolis. And while the technological level is more advanced, something in Nosgoth has seemingly lost is much of its magical elements. Blood Omen's Nosgoth was littered with portals and spells and magical items, and none of those seem to exist in any form in Blood Omen 2. And I don't just mean at a mechanical level. As soon as they're out of that haven, where Kain has been taking his centuries-long power nap, Uma speaks into his mind. Now, telepathy in Legacy of Kain is incredibly common. It's been used since Mortanius first spoke to Kain as a fledgling vampire, but it's always been just magic, just a spell. One among many of them. I mean, in Blood Omen, Kain had enough cards with spells to build himself a Magic the Gathering deck. But in one of the strange decisions for Blood Omen 2, now telepathy is a standard vampire power called the Whisper. Kain has no idea what it is until Uma explains what the Whisper is, and he suddenly remembers it. But he never actively uses it himself to start a conversation, only replying to others. The slums act as your tutorial, but instead of just giving you prompts for controls and letting you just figure stuff out for yourself, Blood Omen 2 holds your hand in a more modern approach to tutorials. And it does so by having Uma explain to you how vampires work in Nosgoth, which is fine, except Kain has already told her he remembers being a vampire. Why would she need to explain that he needs to drink blood to sustain himself? It ends up feeling like pointless exposition. Uma's explanation of the Whisper includes the term for vampire powers, dark gifts. The problem is, the term used for the process of creating a vampire is also called the dark gift, which of course makes it all entirely confusing. New players would hear Uma use the term one way, and before the end of the chapter hear another character use it for the creation way. Consistency. Told you would come up. Worth mentioning, Defiance will go on to keep the term dark gift for the process of creating a vampire, not their abilities. Now, with all that said, the concept and mechanics of vampire lore, meaning growing in power the more blood the vampire drinks, is outstanding. It helps sell the typical Nosgothian point of view that vampires are parasites, simply growing stronger by feeding on the people of Nosgoth. I only nitpick as I hate the name lore for it. But there is another reason I think the lore is also phenomenal, and that's the immersive role-playing aspect of it. For Blood Omen, as I described in the retrospective video, one of the key ideas was the notion of playing a character that needs to feed from and kill innocents to survive. And in the game, you're free to decide Kain's morality by the way you choose to go about feeding. Does Kain drink from the people chained on the walls and other innocents? It's not tracked by a morality system, but it's more for coloring your own experience, your playthrough. The lore does the same. Is the Kain you're playing someone who feeds on his enemies only? Or from those that wish him ill or done him harm? Or is he someone literally power hungry, draining the blood from any and all in his path to increase his lore? There is, after all, very much the ability to do a max lore run where you don't leave anything alive in your path. The next stop is the only actual valuable part of the tutorial, telling you about the glyph magic and how it works. In particular, the ward gates that bar your passage. Most levels have one or more instances of trying to deactivate or circumvent such gates. Unfortunately, the tutorial continues by having Uma teach Kain how to fight, and with the best of intentions, they made this tutorial so slow it's mind-numbingly boring. I'll say it once, hand-holding has no place in the Legacy of Kain series. The final piece of instruction comes in a graveyard, where Uma explains how to use the mist to your advantage. She thoroughly explains the dark gifts, and says they differ from vampire to vampire, and that Kain has lost most of his own, but that he still retains the ability of using the mist. I would have preferred if Kain realized this ability on his own, maybe making a comment saying he's not strong enough to fully assume the mist form from Blood Omen again. But that's nitpicking, I admit. I will say though, the mist form stealth kills are janky as hell. Their animations are often ridiculous. From punching someone through the back and the hand coming out the front holding their heart, to decapitations where the head model is the same for everyone. So no matter who you kill, the head transforms as soon as it leaves the body. In essence, stealth kills are, quite accidentally, utterly delightful and the best part of Blood Omen 2. After the graveyard, and with one short explanation about glyph boxes, aka power junctions, and the glyph rights, who maintain the technology around the city, you're left to your own devices. You catch up with Uma further along and then both cross the bridge that will lead them to another district of the city and closer to Sanctuary, the home of the Cabal. Unfortunately, a Sarafan guard notices Uma, raises the alarm, and the ward gate at the bridge is raised, blocking Kain from following, forcing him to take another path, to find an ally of the Cabal that will open the way to the Smuggler's Den, an even slummier part of the slums, where there are tunnels that Kain can use to reach the lower city. This ally is the character that mentions the Dark Gift in the Vampire Creation way, saying Uma promised him the Dark Gift if he helped. He also mentions that most humans dislike the Sarafan, stating that what they do is unnatural, though what exactly he means is unknown, or maybe other than the fact that the leader is clearly 100% not human. After going through the gate opened by this ally, we see another vampire leap from the shadows and kill the human before the screen fades to black. The Smuggler's Den is the first actual regular level of Blood Omen 2. One thing I didn't mention in the development history section is that of the two branches of Legacy of Kain, the Blood Omen branch and thus Blood Omen 2, were meant to be much more action-oriented with great focus on combat versus the action-adventure playstyle of Soul Reaver. But with that said, Blood Omen 2 still has a lot of puzzles and they're almost exclusively of the kind that people complained about in Soul Reaver. Box pushing. Makes sense, of course. The game was designed and partially built while Soul Reaver was still in development, and so the feedback wasn't there yet. And likely without the proper resources, they simply couldn't make the necessary adjustments to the design. Puzzles in Blood Omen 2 boil down to pushing boxes and pulling levers. More often than not, pushing boxes to stop a door from moving. Blood Omen 2 is very much a stage-based game. Every chapter is a different location of the city with a different mission, and frankly, there are levels where there is little to talk about in terms of story. The Smuggler's Den is one of them, though what I will say is that the aesthetic is pretty damn good. The look and feel of the den is run down, even dirtier than the slums, with rickety-looking stairs and platforms and lots of alleys, with criminals sitting around makeshift fires or patrolling their turfs. If there is one thing Blood Omen 2 nails, it's the look of Meridian. Districts have their own identity, making them memorable, though some more than others. The slums feel dirty and abandoned. The Smuggler's Den feels dangerous, the perfect place for our predator to do his bloody work. Though I will say, one thing I did not expect to see in a random building in the Smuggler's Den is the girl with the pearl earring painting by Johannes Vermeer. I know it's in the public domain, but damn Crystal Dynamics, that's lazy. I can only hope it's a placeholder that was forgotten. Kain's path eventually leads him to a church, and climbing across its roof we find another building with an elevator leading to an underground area with a more industrial feel to it. Lots of steam pipes and valves, and across the distance we see that vampire that killed a human at the end of the previous chapter. And they're talking to one of the Glyphrites, confirming that this is not a friendly face but one of the traitors fighting on the side of the Sarafan. And where Raziel would have made some form of comment, Kain is very much silent. In fact, compared to Blood Omen, in Blood Omen 2, Kain doesn't really say that much outside of major cutscenes. And speaking of the Sarafan, this area is full of their rank and file, the standard city guard, so to speak. And they're a step up from the crooks Kain's been fighting so far, the first enemies to introduce special maneuvers and unblockable attacks that you need to dodge. And that's the perfect moment to talk about the combat. It's bad. It's clumsy, it's slow, and most egregiously, your combat gifts are empowered by attacking but blocking. Let me put that into context. Imagine you're playing God of War and the Spartan Rage build up not by attacking but by blocking. And considering beyond the thugs, most enemies become very adept at blocking and countering with their special attacks, you end up doing just the same, blocking until you have filled the bar enough to trigger a special move. The first one is Fury, which is just a big strong smack. Eventually you get one that is a flurry of attacks, ending in a big slow-mo smack. And the last one you get is an insta-kill fiery smack. But the flow of combat is dull, and where Blood Omen gave you myriad abilities to feel increasingly powerful, so that with the right items and spells you could wipe everything from the map, in Blood Omen 2 you rarely feel more powerful than even the most basic of enemies. Kain eventually catches up to the vampire, and I love how Kain's amnesia just resolves in seconds and is never really a big thing in the plot, because he instantly recognizes the vampire and even remembers his name and every detail about him.
It was Faustus.
This enemy makes an interesting assertion, which contradicts what Uma said earlier, and it's "Our Lord was right, you are alive," meaning the Sarafan Lord knows Kain is out there, so he's not ancient history like Uma said. Ah, consistency, my old friend, how we miss you. Most boss fights in Blood Omen 2 have a puzzle aspect to them, more or less like the first Soul Reaver, but also include a phase where it's just straight up combat. and Faustus has a brawling first phase and a puzzling second one. Unfortunately, that means the first half of this boss fight is more of that dull combat. The second phase is a bit more interesting and has Faustus going to a room with many boilers and he's up on the rafters, every so often landing on a boiler and throwing Molotov cocktails at you, while you're on the ground, which has a lot of mist patches. So you have to mist up, get to the boiler he's on, and turn on the heat. Do it a few times and he's dead. It's not the best design, but a huge upgrade over the first phase. Now, once he's dead comes the part I have the most issues with when it comes to Blood Omen 2, and it's the acquisition of new abilities from the bosses. At the beginning of the game, Uma says that Kain will be able to confront these vampires and then absorb their veins, implying drinking their blood and thus gain their abilities. But what Kain actually does is very much rip the souls from their bodies and absorb them. In other words, the exact same thing Raziel does, and it makes no sense whatsoever. And it's yet another point for Blood Omen 2's lack of consistency. More importantly, Kain is not a wraith, and except for the bosses, absorbing souls is not part of the game. After all, Kain is a vampire. It's such a wasted opportunity, as they could have had draining the bosses contribute to the lore mechanic. Maybe giving you a free lore level, aka a free health increase, much like a heart container in The Legend of Zelda, along with giving you the vampire's powers. Next chapter is the lower city, and Kain reunites for a moment with Uma, who congratulates Kain on making it past the smuggler's den. Kain demands to know who the leader of the resistance is, and Uma refuses to tell him, for secrecy's sake, but that he should go to Sanctuary. Kain is hesitant to say the least, already annoyed at being told where to go, even though go to Sanctuary was already the plan from when they last spoke in the slums, which was at most an hour before, and Kain demands to know where the Sarafan Lord is to take him out. Again, he just woke up from a coma with amnesia about an hour before. Problem is, this version of Kain doesn't have the nuance of his personality in Blood Omen or Soul Reaver. Instead, the only speeds at which he seems to work are petulant, arrogant, and impatient. There are more succinct terms you could use, something relating to a head or a hole, but you can figure that one out for yourself. One point of note is, of course, Uma makes it a big deal about secrecy, but she's the one running around town in a purple bikini, and Kain is strapped in leather and has extremely dead, pale skin exposed. Anyone seeing them would know instantly that they're not human, so all this talk of secrecy and the actions they're taking don't match up. And Kain's attires don't really improve. Fortunately for me, the conceptual version mod I used to play allowed me to change Kain's attire for most levels to the classic Blood Omen iron armor, which looks cool and functional. Ultimately, Kain does as he's told, and even has a moment of introspection wondering why he did as he was told, only for his musings to be cut short by Uma telling him how inspired she was by him and how they'll soon work together to take on their enemies. And the idea, of course, that Kain feels some form of attraction to Uma, and that she's supposed to be the sultry femme fatale. Only problem is, it doesn't work. She doesn't come off as alluring, but patronizing. The tone with which she speaks to him is more akin to saying, "Good doggy, here's your treat," than genuine infatuation. And their interactions are so limited that neither she nor this supposed relationship get any development. So again, doesn't work. The lower city is very much the market town, full of shops and warehouses and taverns. In fact, those three things are the main avenues of Kain's progress. First, seeking out a barmaid to learn the password to pass through a gate, then talk to a guy manning a kiosk to get another password for another gate, while traversing different buildings and manipulating glyph energy where required. Even having an encounter with a glyph rite where the somber figure simply vanishes upon seeing Kain. Eventually he's told where he needs to go, but with the Sarafan out in force and their wards in place, Kain has to travel through the alleys, the rooftops, and the sewers. Fortunately, by consuming Faustus' soul, he obtained the leap ability, allowing him to jump across huge gaps and even leap tackle into enemies. Speaking of enemies, this is a chapter where you have the first fight against a proper Sarafan, a glyph guard, whose armor lights up in the presence of vampires. Orange lines in their armor glow when Kain is in the vicinity. I always call these and the most powerful knight versions of them the Glyphophans. Before he reaches his destination, he comes across the scene of a vicious murder and sees a generic vampire soldier like the one seen in the intro. So you know who it is, that boss with the unfortunate visual design. He's made a mess of things. There's blood and body parts everywhere, and the vampire is relishing in the carnage. He recognizes Kain and says, "The rumors are true." Kain walks Nosgoth again. I thought Faustus said this was a certainty, that the Sarafan Lord knew Kain was up and about. And also again, it's been about an hour since he awoke. I am marveled by the social media speed at which news travels in this city. The vampire tells Kain he'd love to take him out, but he's busy with other things and promptly dashes away. Kain attempts pursuit, but the vampire is simply too agile for him. Though as Kain leaps across 2 buildings, the stranger appears before him again and asks what Kain thinks of his handiwork when feeding, to which Kain tells him he's messy and sloppy and endangers himself by revealing his presence. The vampire says it's Kain who should be worried about his presence, and that he had forgotten how he hated Kain's arrogant tone and would love to silence it. But again, there'll be another time. When asked if he was another of the traitorous vampires serving the Sarafan Lord, this person responds that they only work for themselves. But I can tell you, yes, he does in fact work for the Sarafan. It's painfully obvious. After this meeting and across a few more streets and sewer puzzles, Kain reaches the Blue Lady Curious shop and enters Sanctuary to find the leader is none other than
Vorador,
the father of vampires, the man who raised an entire new generation of the species at the fall of the Pillars, a generation from which Kain drew his armies. He's surrounded by his children, I suppose, who very much look like they should be on the set of Hellraiser, all edgy and leather-bound, the ladies in far skimpier outfits than even Uma. Some think that's something of a trend in Blood Omen 2. And remember I mentioned there was some limited collaborations between Soul Reaver 2 and Blood Omen 2 teams regarding art to ensure consistency? Well, I don't think Vorador was part of that conversation, because he looks nothing like Vorador has ever looked in any other Legacy of Kain game. If it wasn't for them using the name Vorador and having Lukather voice him, you'd think it's someone else entirely. Kain and Vorador's interaction is tense, with Kain claiming he doesn't trust the ancient vampire, and the other in turn rejecting Kain's courteous greetings, telling him this is an alliance of necessity only. And even from the very first time I played this game, I wondered where this animosity came from. The intro shows them working together as part of Kain's conquest, and their interaction in Blood Omen is positive. In that game, Vorador is perhaps Kain's only true ally, without an agenda. But this is another instance of Blood Omen 2 just setting up a status quo without telling you how things got here, or just simply having characterization that doesn't match up with the rest of the series. But despite the animosity, Vorador does welcome Kain to Sanctuary, and Kain makes a quip of how it's not as lavish as Vorador's manor, while the S&M Peanut Gallery give him blank-eyed stares. Vorador tells him that vampires are once again facing extinction, to which Kain reminds the ancient vampire that this has happened before and they bounced back. In particular because Vorador created a new vampire generation and asks why not do that again. But Vorador claims it takes too much time and energy, resources he doesn't have. Kain admits creating vampires is beyond him, and from Soul Reaver we know creating a vampire involves raising the dead, putting a soul in the body, trapping it there, which, if you remember, was the Elder God's big gripe with vampires. So if Kain can't do this, it further calls into question how in the Hilden Hell dimension he can rip and consume the souls of the bosses and gain their abilities. Before the conversation can go any further, an injured vampire arrives and tells him that after acquiring the information she'd been sent to gather in the industrial district, Uma was captured and taken to the Sarafan Keep for execution. So Kain is to meet with the Bishop of Meridian in the upper city and tell him that Vorador sent him, so the old man can grant Kain access to the Sarafan Keep. The bishop works for the Cabal, having been promised the dark gift. Much like the man in the slums, immortality is quite the prize, Vorador explains, especially for those who lack faith in an afterlife. Kain says they need to get her information, but Vorador says they need to save her. Kain agrees, but he very much comes across as yeah, sure. And you can't blame him. He's known Uma for a couple of hours at this point, so he has no reason to care even a little bit about her. Kain travels by tramway to the upper city, with its big houses, opulent mansions, clean streets, and the cathedral. Making his way through the streets and disposing of the still present criminal elements, he meets another of the traitor's vampires standing in his way, Marcus. He and Kain give a quick rundown of how poorly their relationship ended, with Kain hoping that Marcus would die in battle, and it's more than implied that Kain tried to kill him unsuccessfully. Marcus survived and went into hiding, and then when the dust settled, offered his services to the Sarafan Lord. Kain, amused, tells him he's sorry that his poor aim caused him such distress, and that he's not surprised at the turn of events. He always knew Marcus to be an opportunistic coward, but promises to this time finish the job and kill him completely. Marcus isn't intimidated and tells Kain it won't be that way. His powers have grown so much, he can now subjugate the minds of anyone he wants. He tries controlling Kain, but it doesn't work, and Kain mocks him for this, asking if he's just practiced on mortals, their minds full of, well, crap. But Marcus did succeed at something in his attempt, reading Kain's thoughts and learning of the bishop. Kain even sounds impressed. Marcus runs away, heading to the bishop's home to get him first, while leaving Kain to deal with some mind-controlled thugs. They're easily disposed of. And after this scene, I remind you that Kain's supposed to have fragmented memories. He's supposed to be amnesiac. How ironic that that bit's immediately forgotten. Kain follows in Marcus's footsteps and sees the vampire tell the Sarafan guards to kill Kain on sight. Kain pursues him across the district, through houses and squares, fighting an increasingly large contingent of Sarafan. Most of them Glyphophans and a few of the first Sarafan knights, which have normal armors but huge axes for weapons and use highly damaging bull rushes as their unblockable attacks. Unfortunately, as it is for every single enemy, fighting them is the same deal. Block, then offensive dark gift, dodge around the unblockable, rinse and repeat. Kain reaches the Bishop of Meridian but finds him unable to speak, his ability to convey words and seemingly any intelligence already under Marcus's control. Marcus tells Kain he's too late, that as long as the Bishop is under the vampire's control, he'll never get what he needs and there is no way Kain can catch him. And then he runs away. So of course you run after him and catch him in the cathedral, where probably one of gaming's worst designed boss fights takes place. Not to mention, given the Serafan's control and their active pursuit of the Cabal and its members, if Marcus is working for them, why would he not simply control the Bishop, learn what the plan is, and then just kill him? There is no reason beyond Kain needs the Bishop alive to continue the plot, or that old man not to be pulled from next year's census. Marcus staying behind and telling Kain what's happened makes full sense given their earlier conversation. He wants Kain to know he's got one over him. They're not just enemies, but rivals in a way. And Marcus clearly needs to prove he's better. For the short amount of time that Marcus is on screen, he's pretty consistent in his personality and his interactions with Kain. I honestly wish he had a better role. I would have swapped the generic soldier model vampire, who we'll meet again soon, for Marcus. He's got more of a distinct look, even though all of them are just lanky, bald vampires. And Marcus has a more interesting relationship with Kain compared to the others. So a slower burn on their clash would have been so much better to build on that rivalry they seem to have. Now the boss fight. The way Marcus's mind control is portrayed for the fight is making him invisible. The first phase has you ringing bells to stun him and get a few hits. At some point, the phase transitions and he summons 2 acolytes to destroy the mechanisms that ring the bells. The next phase has Marcus summoning more of these acolytes while running around invisible. When he needs to summon more, he materializes and stands on a platform, and Kain needs to leap across the gap and tackle him for a few more hits. Problem is, at some point in the fight, when he's got about a quarter health left, which still needs like 5 or 6 full combos to kill, he permanently goes invisible and just runs around, with the acolyte simply spawning without the summon animation he did before. While invisible, you can see his outline if he comes close to you, so you have to lock on to empty air and attack where you think he is and deal damage if he actually is there. In the third-person vampire version of Battleship, it can go on forever and it's incredibly dull. But with him dead, you can now use the Charm Dark Gift and the Bishop's mind is released. The old cleric considers breaking into the Sarafan Keep a fool's errand, but agrees to show Kain how to get there. Upon reaching the entrance to the keep, Vordor contacts Kain, congratulating him on his success. And when Kain mentions Marcus, Vordor says he tried many times to recruit him to no avail, which means Vordor knows every single one of the traitor's vampires, but doesn't say anything. Vordor informs Kain that he can sense Uma being held at the top of the keep, and that she's to be executed soon. But how does he know this? The only thing the injured vampire reported is that they were holding her for public execution. You'll find in this level there are human sympathizers inside the keep, but they don't have phones. and Uma's capture is incredibly recent. Did Uma whisper him what was happening? If so, why didn't she just outright tell Vordor the information she uncovered, in case she didn't make it? Things in Blood Omen 2 seem to happen because they have to, but rarely because it makes sense. Think about it, the Sarafan Keep is locked up tight, so the chances of updates and other information getting to Vordor from here are extremely unlikely. But back to the story, Kain is not really interested in Uma. Instead, he just wants to know where the Sarafan Lord is. And Vordor doesn't know, but he urges Kain not to be rash. That Uma's intel is far more important, since it'll give him a chance to actually defeat their enemy. After the whisper ends, Kain expresses how tired he is of all these warnings, how he just wants to rip his enemy apart. Again, the problem is that all these events up to this chapter have occurred within the space of a few hours or a day at most, if we assume that between Sanctuary and the Upper City a night has passed. Though given the urgency with which Vordor speaks when dispatching Kain to meet the bishop, it would be safe to assume it's the same night. In either case, Kain hasn't been active long enough to be this impatient, especially since he's aware he was defeated at very much the height of his powers, and he's nowhere near that level anymore. He was defeated while wielding the Soul Reaver. Just another instance in which the writers focus exclusively on Kain's arrogance and pride, without all other personality traits to balance them out. It makes it so Kain is nowhere near as compelling as he is on other titles. He's very much a one-note character. There are exceptions, moments where he's got a bit more depth, but overall, the characterization of this wonderful character in Blood Omen 2 leaves much to be desired. With Charm, Kain can now control the minds of humans to possess them, using them to mostly flip switches that Kain can't reach. Which, curiously, is also how you use mind control spells in the first Blood Omen, to activate switches. So at least in one ability, Blood Omen 2 remains consistent with its predecessor. Unfortunately, what the game considers line of sight for using Charm changes depending on the level and what the designers want you to do. One such example comes into play in the Keep. You begin the level taking out a guard and using Charm through a window to get a servant to open a door for you. From there, Kain moves to the lower levels and barracks up to the more social areas with feast halls, galleries, and libraries. One path is closed to Kain with a member of the Cabal standing on the other side of the grating. This woman demands Kain to help before she'll render any aid, asking him to kill someone coming into the fortress, a human in a blue suit, someone who according to her is a traitor and must be killed. The curious thing is that if you try to use Charm on her, it won't even target her. The reticule won't change color to indicate a valid target, forcing you to do the little side quest. Would have been great to have seen Kain attempt to charm, see that it doesn't work, that this mortal woman's mind is too strong, and then grudgingly accept to do her bidding. But at least give the players the chance to try. The Sarafan Keep does prove something that Kain says at the end of Soul Reaver. Their agenda was the same as ours. In other words, much like Kain's desire for conquest, the Sarafan wanted the same. And this version of the Sarafan, as removed as it is from the original order created by the Circle of Nine, also has the same agenda. For one, they control Nosgoth. And secondly, as seen in a room where a merchant is arguing with a knight, the Sarafan have very few qualms about killing innocent people, with the merchant swiftly killed for defying the authority of the order. Kain reaches the top of the keep and finds Uma's cell. He asks Uma for the information, but she refuses, worried that Kain will take the intel and leave her behind. Kain asks, bewildered, if he's not yet earned her trust. And I know I sound like a broken record here, but you've only known each other for a handful of hours. Of course there's no trust. Not to mention that again, Kain only has angry, petulant, and arrogant as his base speeds, and a reputation likely instilled into these characters by their patriarch, Vordor. Kain releases Uma, and as they leave her cell, they come face to face with the Sarafan Lord. And here Kain discovers his enemy has something else going for him, the Soul Reaver. Yet it doesn't give him pause. It doesn't diminish the arrogance. Kain, better than anyone, should know what it means to be struck by the Soul Reaver. And before anyone can claim it's because of the amnesia that he's acting this way, he recognizes the Soul Reaver just fine. The Sarafan Lord demands to know who dares to intrude upon his domain and kill his people, then seems genuinely confused when looking at Kain. and the vampire tells him,
"You know me."
The Sarafan Lord is bewildered by Kain's presence and makes it clear he thought Kain had been destroyed. But, not letting an opportunity to add insult to injury pass by him, the Sarafan mocks Kain for how all the vampire's plans and schemes were brought down by him. Kain tells him those words will be his epitaph and actually lunges to attack. First, that's profoundly stupid, even for Kain. Especially for Kain. Again, he knows better than anyone how dangerous the Soul Reaver is, and still goes for it, blasted back towards Uma by an energy projectile from the Reaver. And apparently that kind of projectile doesn't carry the soul-stealing ability of the blade, which is convenient. Second, the Sarafan Lord's apparent surprise at seeing Kain completely contradicts what the other vampires have stated, but the Sarafan Lord knew that Kain was around. So Blood Omen 2's writing proves itself inconsistent yet again. Despite what just happened, Kain insists on fighting the Sarafan Lord, but Uma casts a teleport spell that takes him back to Sanctuary. While Kain was helping her out of the cell, she had mentioned the spell and that the enchanted walls of the cell blocked the magic, which at the very least explains why she couldn't have just escaped on her own. They land in Sanctuary, and Vordor is relieved to see his child and thanks Kain for his efforts. Uma says she found something in the industrial district, a portal that led to a place she had never seen before, the gateway held open by a single item, which she thinks is the Nexus stone. Vordor explains it's an item that can be used to create such gateways to any place on Noskov, and it also holds the power, for some unexplained reason, to block the Soul Reaver. Kain wonders if this is just another rumor that will prove itself false at some critical juncture, but Vordor says they know it works because the Sarafan Lord used it when he fought Kain those centuries before. Kain promptly agrees to recover the stone, but makes it clear that he's taking it for himself to use against their enemy, and Vordor agrees. In the industrial district, Kain fights his way through Sarafan forces to reach a gondola that will take him into the heart of the factories. And this chapter introduces another enemy, the Sarafan Archer, or as I call them, the Nanophans, as they have a headdress that makes them look like nuns, though they are even more scantily clad than Vordor's court, which is saying something. In Blood Omen 2, women are either in fancy dresses or skimpy clothes, no other ways about it. The Industrial Quarter is a chapter in the game with elements that make no sense in terms of world logic. For example, a common item used for progress in the chapter are these spherical furnaces with switches that instantly explode the moment the switch is pulled, and there is apparently no other purpose for them. You only ever find them stacked together or on little rail cars. For a moment I thought, oh, they're portable furnaces for these rail cars, but no. Later on in the game you find the same machines functioning perfectly well without these instantly exploding balls of death. Another example is a room where you need to force one of those aforementioned rail cars with a bomb on it to stop below a jet of flame, using some roadblocks to stop the car just under the fire. Problem is, the room serves no other purpose. There is no machinery, there are people milling about without any purpose, and the rail track is circular. It's there merely for the purpose of being a puzzle you need to solve, and a very simple one at that, and not because it's a part of the industrial complex. When Kain does reach the chamber with the Nexus stone, there is no gateway, just the stone suspended in something of a stasis field. And the reason for this is that likely they wanted to avoid ruining the surprise of seeing the device for the first time later in the game. Still, it makes Uma's statement of the portal seem inconsistent with, well, reality. But waiting for Kain in this chamber is generic vampire soldier guy, who now Kain recognizes as Sebastian. And I'll be honest, my biggest shock was that his name didn't end in US like Faustus and Marcus, and the one we've yet to meet, Magnus. Sebastian was part of Kain's army but defected to the Sarafan and orchestrated the ambush where many of Kain's army died. Kain demands to know why Sebastian did it, and the other vampire says he wasn't going to serve Kain while he ruled Noskov, when he himself wanted that, and says that the Sarafan Lord values him and he will rule by his master's side. So, he betrayed Kain because he didn't want to play second fiddle to him, so his solution is to play second fiddle to someone else. Yeah, that tracks. That makes perfect sense. Another boss fight ensues, this one with some environmental elements, but really nothing that saves it from being as dreary as all the others, as it's very much the same as fighting Faustus, block, block, strike, block, block, strike. With Sebastian defeated, Kain Soul Reavers him and gains his powers. Sebastian's ability was originally something akin to force speed in the Jedi Knight games, slowing everything down around Kain but allowing him to move at almost normal speed. But balance issues arose and thus it was changed to a second offensive gift, Frenzy, which takes a big chunk of the bar for that flurry and slow-mo smack I mentioned before. But before his enemy dies, Kain interrogates Sebastian, demanding to know where the portal the Nexus Stone powered leads. He promises to spare Sebastian should he answer, but the traitorous vampire doesn't believe it for a second. Still, he spills the beans, just to see the look on Kain's face when he realizes he's powerless and can't possibly win. The portal leads to an ancient device buried deep on the Meridian. Kain asks what the purpose of the device is, how does it benefit the Sarafan Lord? But Sebastian doesn't know, but is certain it spells the doom for Kain. So Sebastian's big thing here is, I want you to realize how screwed you are when I tell you nothing of consequence. Kain laments that Sebastian chose this path, saying things could have been glorious, but not everyone shares his vision. He tells the dying vampire that his death will only make Kain stronger and hopes that brings some comfort to him in his grave. With Sebastian dead and consumed, Kain takes the Nexus Stone and everything around him explodes. Kain awakens in Sanctuary and is told by Vorador that he was unconscious some distance away from the debris and was brought back. The Sarafan in the area too distracted with finding out what had happened to pay attention to Kain. And here I wonder another thing. Kain has the Nexus Stone, and even with it powering a portal to a specific place, what we know of it is, it's supposed to allow whoever has it to open such gateways anywhere on Nosgoth. At least that's what Vorador said. So why did they make Kain just get blown up and have to be rescued instead of having him use the stone and pop up in Sanctuary? I'll mention this, and I know it comes off as a nitpick, and I've already been very critical of the game so far. But at no point in the entire game does the open a gateway anywhere on Nosgoth part of the Nexus Stone come into play. It's never used that way, and it's not the last time Kain's mission ends with a massive explosion and Kain departing the Team Rocket way. Worse still, the Nexus Stone is not even used to travel to the device. Kain gets there through other means. And it's not used to fight the Sarafan Lord. It's used to close the Hilden Gate, the portal to their world. So the true purpose for the MacGuffin that opens portals is to use it to close a portal. If that isn't inconsistent writing, I don't know what is. Kain mentions to Vorador what Sebastian said about the device, asking the Elder Vampire if he knows something. And Vorador says he's heard of discoveries deep underground and legends speak of huge machines left behind by the gods in eons past. And I'm going to be gracious here and assume that by gods he means the ancient vampires or the Hilden. In fact, the devices of Hilden make, because otherwise it means yet another thing Blood Omen 2 is throwing into the pot that has no reference anywhere else, that being ancient gods. But given Vorador's reverence for his maker and the ancients, it would be a safe assumption that he means the ancient races when he speaks of gods. Vorador knows of someone who can help provide more information, someone older than even he, a seer that owes him a favor. He instructs Kain to go to her and learn what she knows. And here is another point where I complain about the writing. Because the next thing Kain does is complain about the city being a fortress, and how does Vorador expect him to leave the city? Yes, the Seer is in the wilderness. Only Vorador didn't say anything about where she is. He only said she was a Seer, she was older than him, and owed him a favor. This script was in dire need of some proofreading. Nevertheless, Vorador knows of yet more secret passages that can take Kain outside the city walls and to the canyons that lead to her home, and he will share what he knows. The canyons take Kain past the walls and into the dreary countryside of Nosgoth. This is a barren landscape, very familiar to those who played Soul Reaver, so one may assume that Nosgoth's decay has progressed to this stage already in the 400 years since Kain made his choice to dam the pillars. The outskirts are dangerous, full of strange demons and bandits. Most of the bandits you encounter are women, and I'll give you a couple of guesses how they're dressed. I'll give you a hint. The term bikini armor comes to mind. On the way out, we see a merchant stopping his truck near the gate, where the Sarafan Knight informs him that the bridge is out and hasn't been repaired, that all the manpower is being diverted to eradicate the bandit camp and deal with the demonic entities that make the canyons their home. These demons have no resemblance to those found in the other games in the series, looking very much like skeletal bugs, though somehow still having lots of blood in their veins, If you struggle to fight one, it's quite possible to refill your health to full with just one of them. Something that becomes a trend with enemies from the Industrial Quarter on, the adversaries turning into blood banks upon death. Across the canyons we find Sarafan encampments, some of them having mining facilities, but no matter the purpose for them, they're all empty. Their inhabitants long escaped or killed. In fact, we see many a Sarafan knight engaged with the demon bugs in combat, and almost every time, the bugs win. Kain finds the Seer in a small shack, and she very much looks like a Hilden, but also different. And the possibilities for why there is are many, and we have no official explanation. She could simply be what Hilden women look like. In the same line of thought, she could be a Hilden woman who remained on Nosgoth after the binding, or her features were not altered by the extended stay in the demonic realm, that world having some form of transformative effect on creatures, which is mentioned on both Blood Omen 2 and Defiance. My own personal theory, given that she has big fangs, is that she may be a vampire Hilden hybrid, perhaps born from star-crossed lovers during the war between the ancients, Romeo and Juliet Nosgoth edition. Anything could be possible. We do know for certain that she is a woman in Blood Omen 2, so of course, she's in the skimpiest of outfits. The Seer is not impressed by Kain and dismisses him. Kain demands the information and says he will not leave without it. The Seer mocks Kain and asks if he likes being Borodor's lapdog, and he gets right up in her face and says that he serves no one. And that's enough for her to go weak in the knee, change her tone drastically, and acquiesce to Kain's request, as she feels his conviction. She explains the device has been dormant for a long time, but the Sarafan Lord found it and is preparing to unleash the device's destructive power on Nosgoth. She mentions the device entrance is marked with a sign and shows a hologram of it, and tells Kain that no human can manipulate that sign, that switch, because it's still Blood Omen 2. So of course it's a switch. She tells him that maybe a vampire could manipulate it. Kain wants to know what he needs to do, and she beckons him closer before really coming on strong and nearly pushing her wrists into his mouth for him to drink. Kain, a bit flustered, takes a step back and asks what kind of creature she is. She tells him that's irrelevant. But before she can speak another word, the building rocks and we see the Sarafan Lord outside with his forces, attempting to burn the building down to eliminate them both. How did the Sarafan Lord know Kain was here, and how did he get here so fast? Unknown, and it feels like a missed opportunity for some intrigue in the plot. Imagine if this drew Kain to wonder if there is a mole in the Cabal, someone acting as a double agent, and tying this to Uma's capture earlier in the game. But no, the Seer urges Kain to drink from her, telling him it's the only way he'll be able to fulfill his mission. And he does, and things get weird, with the Seer greatly enjoying the sensation and moaning her appreciation for Kain and calling him her Dark Prince. Kain already has the power to manipulate objects with his mind, but he has to be very close to them, as seen every time he is pushing or pulling a box. He merely holds his hand close to it and moves it by will alone. The Seer explains that by drinking her blood, this ability has now been empowered and turned into full-on telekinesis, meaning the range has significantly extended. Does this mean you can now use telekinesis to move boxes? No, of course it doesn't. That would require Blood Omen 2 to be consistent. No, telekinesis is only used to turn on these switches and to do a mild shove on enemies. But if there's one thing I will say is that drinking from the Seer proves that Kain can gain abilities of others from drinking their blood, which is what Uma said at the beginning of the game. So why they decided on the Soul Reaver Tribute Act makes no sense whatsoever. The Sarafan Lord stands outside and he is definitely there for Kain to eliminate him and all his allies. Which really begs the question I asked before. How did he know? In any case, the Seer tells Kain their enemy is here and tells him his destiny is fast approaching, and that she will teleport him to the device's entrance. Kain asks what about her, and tells her to come with him, that he needs allies after all. And it's the first time in this entire game where Kain shows some measure of care for anyone or realize that he may need allies. But the Seer is incredulous at his words of being allies and assures him her fate lies somewhere else, and teleports him away. Kain finds himself outside a massive metal edifice, with the symbol the Seer mentioned high above, and as I said, it's a switch. In fact, for all the Seer's claims that the symbol marks the building, sort of implying it's the symbol for the device, every single telekinesis switch has the same design, so I don't know what she's going on about. Kain uses his new ability to open the way and quickly finds himself in a room with a languishing, hideous beast. The creature seems to know him, and Kain is curious about it, mentioning how his memory is spotty, but that even with that, he would remember such a creature. But the beast says they haven't met, but he knows of Kain. And I call shenanigans here because at no point has Kain's memory been anything other than perfect. So this little quip about his memory not being perfect is not earned. Kain tells the monster he's looking for the device, and the creature says he can help, but that Kain can't destroy it on his own. He needs to find the builder, who's imprisoned in the Eternal Prison. Kain recognizes the name and says he had heard of this place, but didn't know it was so close at hand, and asks how he may reach it. Now warning, this is a nitpick, I admit it, but it's yet another of those it's here for game purposes but makes no sense in logic moments. The beast tells Kain there's a tunnel leading from this room to beyond the city and specifically to the Eternal Prison, which is extremely convenient, but that's not what my nitpick is. My issue is that this being is a captive. He's stuck here, unable to escape, yet he has the power to open doors for you, which makes zero sense. You don't give the prisoner the master key for all the doors. Kain leaves this area and heads to the Eternal Prison, outright the best chapter in Out of Blood Omen 2. This place is great by virtue of being completely bonkers, and because of the jailers, who look like executioners. They are comedy gold. They are dedicated to taking people that have a
dangerous imbalance within themselves
and must
contemplate the wrongs that they have done through peaceful, uninterrupted meditation until they have regained the balance of their true, perfect inner nature.
And they accomplish this by essentially torturing the prisoners over and over, killing them in ridiculous ways, and then doing it all over again. The Eternal Prison is demented, and the jailers and their dialogue makes this level a complete delight. The jailers ask Kain if he's a guest, a visitor, or an intruder, and then after explaining what they're doing here say, no guests or visitors allowed, and intruders they know how to deal with, and tell Kain to just go away. They keep making demands for Kain's departure as the vampire makes progress through the facility until they have enough and start attacking him. Aside from these guards, the only other enemies are these horrendous pale white spiders that look very much like the demon insects from the canyons, but are incredibly easy to kill and pose little to no threat. Now, I said I really enjoy this level, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have some issues, and it has two glaring ones. The first one is that Kain gets to the builder by measures of convenience and coincidence that defy belief. He makes his way through the facility and at one point lowers the cell of a random prisoner, who is a Hilden, and knees the poor wretch and asks about the builder, and lo and behold, it's him! That was easy. And the second one is once again that issue of game versus logic, as a section has Kain opening cells to use ladders found within. And in this section, you sometimes have to use mind control to get the prisoners to pull levers to open their cells from the inside. What kind of a prison gives the prisoners control over the door of their own cell? Makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. But the Eternal Prison is not just home to the poor wretches shuffling inside, nor the comical jailers. There's also a deranged creature covered in scars and having a boiler strapped to his back and his brain exposed. He storms around the place and more than once appears in pursuit of Kain, until the vampire manages to drop him into various bodies of water. Kain finds the builder, and the Hilden explains he built the machine in his pride to destroy the vampires, but came to regret his decision, and before he could undo it, he was imprisoned here. He explains the device's purpose is to channel the power of a creature they devise and simply call the Mass, and that the builder's blood can poison and kill it, thus turning the device unusable. Kain just needs to feed on him and make the builder's blood part of his own. That way he may also poison the creature. In exchange for this, the builder asks for simply being allowed to die, to which Kain acquiesces. On his way back, the strange and seemingly immortal creature with a boiler continues his pursuit of Kain, completely deranged and claiming to see many enemies around, and starts a boss fight, and he has the power to immolate things. In the first phase, you push him into the water with telekinesis, while using statues of the jailers for cover. And in the next phase, the point is to get him to rush into big versions of those statues and reveal switches that, when activated, reverse time and rebuild a broken statue of the time streamer, Mobius, which you then topple and drop on the creature. In its final moments, this being regains their composure and clarity, and they recognize Kain as their lord. This is Magnus, Kain's former champion. his right-hand man and someone from whom Kain felt the deepest betrayal, thinking Magnus sold him out to the Sarafan Lord. But Magnus reveals that wasn't what happened, that the night he slipped away from the military camp, he planned to strike at the Sarafan Lord and kill him, to end the war then and there, but he failed and was put into the eternal prison where he, as we have seen from his appearance, has suffered greatly, to the point where even his mind was compromised. He begs Kain's forgiveness for his failure and for his lord to grant him death, and Kain agrees, telling him he suffered long enough and that he grants him his release. I like this scene a lot. It gives Kain a lot more nuance, something he's been severely lacking for the entirety of the game, and he goes from accusatory to realizing not just his mistake but how much Magnus has been put through, and gives his former champion his desire to be released. It's great. The game could have used more of this Kain. He then takes Magnus' soul and obtains Immolation, the final offensive gift, taking the entire bar to activate but instantly killing the target. Returning to the device, he tells the beast in there that he has the Builder's blood and he is now ready to destroy the mass and the device. So of course, the beast opens another door that leads deeper into the compound. But before he does, he reveals that their enemy are the Hilden, creatures from another world, which at this point in history is technically true. He says they control the glyph magic and pull the strings behind the scenes, disguised as the glyph rites, and that their leader is, of course, the Sarafan Lord. In fact, when Kain moves through the facility on his way to the device and the mass, he sees a room with a glyph rite, abandoning the disguise to show his true appearance, and they're of course identical to the Builder, down to a little hospital gown. You would have thought that was a simple attire for a prisoner, but you can tell now that it is very much the height of Hilden fashion. There isn't much to tell about this level, other than Kain eventually reaches the mass, and to me it's always looked like Baronade, the boss from the great Jabu Jabu dungeon in Ocarina of Time. It's massive and takes up multiple floors of the facility. Kain fights his way to where the maw is and lets a few drops of his blood fall into it. And immediately the building begins to rock and shake and heave as the mass dies. Kain takes a lift back to that control room, and instead of the beast, he finds himself face to face with one of the ancients. Janos Audrin. Turns out that he had been captured as seen at the end of Defiance when Hashak Geek, aka the Sarafan Lord, took over his body and then used him to feed the mass. The constant draining of his vitality made him devolve into the beast. But the moment Kain killed the mass, he felt his strength return. He claims that which is divine cannot be fully suppressed, implying that vampirism is divine in some way, which takes me back to the Soul Reaver intro. We became less human and more divine. Kain suggests imprisonment made him lose his mind, that vampirism is a curse, not a mark of divinity. But Janos tells him he needs to look deeper into vampire history to understand their lineage, and that even long before Janos was born, vampires were godlike and ruled Nosgoth, but were opposed by another race, the Hilden, similar in power but different in purpose and intent, probably referring to the fact that the ancient vampires worshipped the Wheel of Fate, the Hilden did not, and that different belief sparked the war. Janos gives a quick rundown of the war, how it ended with the vampires banishing the Hilden to another dimension and sealing them there. Those very Hilden are now the enemies Kain is fighting, returned and preparing to deliver their vengeance. Kain asks if they were banished, how are they here, and Janos drops the bombshell on him. One of them, the Sarafan Lord, managed to slip in, and he's helped bring others across, the binding loosening when Kain refused to sacrifice. The Hilden also require humans to drain their energy, which is vague in terms of describing how the Hilden consume their victims, as this is not seen in any way in Blood Omen 2. And they also needed to build an army, so the Sarafan Lord recreated the Sarafan, inspired by the ancient order that held the same ideals of vampire extermination, using that symbol to rally humans to their cause, though of course doing so without using any of the actual historical iconography of the order. Kain wonders if he was the cause then, for all this to happen, and then dismisses it, saying that he was put on the path from the beginning, and wonders if everything had been a Hilden plot from the start. Which takes me back to the Soul Reaver 2 retrospective, and Raziel's hypothesis that given the dark forces at play, maybe things would have turned out exactly the same even if Kain sacrificed himself, his death having no impact on the Pillar of Balance and the Binding. I still believe Raziel had a point. After all, why would Hashak Geek fight Kain and try to kill him at the end of Blood Omen if his death is going to mean the restoration of the pillars and so undo all of his plans? Only way it makes sense is if Kain's death meant nothing. Also worth noting that while Kain wonders if he's the cause, he doesn't actually mention the Pillars of Nosgoth in any way. A full portal through which his people could return, and if this portal is destroyed, it's going to banish all the Hilden back whence they came, making it impossible for them to survive on this world. Kain asks how they'll accomplish this, and Janos says they need to return to Sanctuary and inform Vordor. And I ask, how does he know this? He's been trapped in this machine for freaking ever, so no one could have told him about Sanctuary, the Cabal, or that Vordor was still alive. Consistency, logic, I miss these so much. Back in Sanctuary, Vordor is shocked to see his sire, and Uma tells Kain they were wondering where he was, with Kain replying that he was doing what he said he would do. Janos informs them all about the Hilden and tells them they need to plan and prepare to end things, to prevent the Sarafan Lord from bringing the rest of the Hilden across. Janos wanted to teleport them all directly into the Hilden's foothold, the Hilden City. But something is preventing him from sensing it, so someone needs to go there and disable whatever shield is blocking his efforts. Kain asks Vorador about the Hilden City, if any of his spies have found anything relating to that. And the Elder Vampire turns to Uma for this information. And his child says that for a long while there's been a lot of activity at the docks, with ships being loaded up and sailing to destinations unknown. Janos says this is likely the Hilden City and tells Kain to go there and bring down the barrier. Kain says he needs someone to show him to the wharfs, and Uma tells Vorador she'll take care of this, despite his protest that he needs her in Sanctuary with him. As she states, she knows the wharfs and it also increases their chances of success if she joins Kain. Kain claims to not need the help, but Janos tells him that with so much at stake to take the help where it's offered. Kain thinks to himself that in his experience, help offered when not needed is usually no help at all. And frankly, I'm with him on this, particularly considering Uma's insistence means she just wants to join to keep an eye on him. Kain and Uma arrive at the Wharf District, on one side of a path covered in mist and Sarafan Knights. Kain is wearing the most ridiculous armor ever portrayed in any video game. It's bright gold and has spikes so large coming out of the sides that would make it impossible for him to go through any door. It doesn't look functional, it frankly looks silly. Such a wasted opportunity to actually give him the old iron armor from Blood Omen, give Kain his classic look for the final battle. I was sad that even with a conceptual mod, I could not override this silly armor. Kain turns to Uma and wants to know the details of the area, what kind of Sarafan presence is to be found. And she says it's going to be the most difficult area, the Sarafan having an outpost that controls access to and from the docks. He then approaches Kain and asks what his plans are after he kills the Sarafan Lord. Kain states she knows the answer. He'll resume his path of conquest and lay claim to Meridian. Uma wants to know what he'll do about the other vampires, like the Cabal, but Kain says they're free to do whatever they wish. It's at this point that Uma takes the Nexus stone from him, stating Vorador told Uma all the stories about Kain, how he'll stop at nothing until he has complete control, and that he definitely will not just leave them be. After all, they're the only ones who could stop him. So he's going to hunt them down and kill them all, and how is that different from the Sarafan Lord? Kain snaps at her, saying he doesn't need to explain himself to anyone, and that no one, not even she, will stand in his way. Uma says this is as far as Kain's journey goes, that she will kill the Sarafan Lord herself, but Kain tells her she has no shot at surviving that fight, and to give him the stone or he will pry it from her fingers as she dies. Uma says now the beast shows his true nature, and so quickly too, that she wished that things would be different between them. What the hell did she expect? If Vorador told her anything, is that Kain doesn't deal with manipulations well. Hell, he said that to her at the start of the game, that he'd been a pawn before and it ended poorly. And he's been killing traitors the entire game. What other reaction was she expecting? Not to mention, it's pure hypocrisy. She acts against him and then expects what? That he'll be calm and not tell her he'll rip her head off? Not to mention the whole I wish things had been different just doesn't work. It implies there's something between them and there isn't. Blood Omen 2 desperately wants to have romance elements, but like I've said a million times by now, it doesn't work. The pacing of the game has not given them any chance to even develop a friendship, let alone something more. In other words, Blood Omen 2 has not earned this moment. Uma teleports to safety and Kain is left to fend for himself, to find his own way around the wharf. Crossing the bridge, disposing of guards and controlling humans to open gates, he finds himself in a small market area. There is a gate he must cross, but the person across it demands a password. So we're back to the same conceit from the Lower City chapter. Only now it's worse, because you can't charm the person asking for the password. You actually have to go and get the password by eavesdropping on some merchants. The main base of the Sarafan still stands in his way, and Kain opens the path by manipulating the lighthouses, causing ships to come and go, one of them a Sarafan supply ship, which makes them lower the outpost's drawbridge. Kain then carves a path for himself by releasing some of the dangerous cargo in the Sarafan warehouses, such as the spiders from the canyons and one beefy unstoppable demon. Along the way to the ship that will take him to the Hidden City after crossing the drawbridge, Kain finds Uma, badly wounded after having fought a few Sarafan guards. Looking down on her, Kain asks what happened. Wasn't she supposed to bring the Sarafan Lord to his knees on her own? She collapses from her injuries and admits her mistake, that she couldn't carry the fight. Kain tells her she was brave to try, and when she says she's dying, he simply confirms it. She begs for his blood, saying that it's the only thing that can save her life, and once again, he simply agrees with that statement.
I know,
he says, softly, but doesn't move to help her, simply taking the Nexus stone back. He then puts to her a simple question, if she believes that he can conquer Nosgoth, and she agrees. She sees it now, replies the same way to the follow-up question, if she believes Nosgoth rightfully belongs to Kain. Kain speaks quietly, composed but also cold, and tells her she can die knowing those truths, before striking her down, leaving her to bleed out. He says she should never have betrayed him, that she could have been his queen and now has left him alone. Unfortunately for Uma, she thought her way back to safety was to stroke Kain's ego, and she didn't realize he was just testing her. Perhaps if she'd stuck to her guns and resisted, he might have kept her alive. Or more likely, it didn't matter what she said, the betrayal was already enough to seal her fate. And her sudden submissive turn out of desperation simply told Kain everything he needed to know about who Uma really was. And you know what I'm gonna say, and I'm gonna say it for the last time. The whole melodrama of you could have been my queen, just no. The game hasn't earned this moment. That relationship is not given the time to develop in any meaningful way. Not even attraction. So I find it hard to believe that Kain would have even considered Uma someone important enough to give a damn about. Even less think of her as a long-term companion. In any case, Kain leaves Uma behind and makes his way to the Hidden City, and I hate this final level. It goes on for far too long. Having said so, I love the intro to this area. It calls back to Bram Stoker's Dracula and the Journey of the Demeter. Arriving to its destination with the entire crew dead, so too does the ship arrive to the Hidden City, crashing to the harbor, the crew drained of their blood or just butchered by Kain. Visually, the city is really interesting and definitely conveys the vibe of an alien place. And it has some really interesting elements for the Legacy of Kain mythos, such as there being humans in the city that predate the Hilden's return, as they comment to Kain that their stories, passed down through generations, spoke of the city and its people, and how the ships keep bringing in more humans but that they don't share the local history, and have to be taught about the demons and such. Demons from their point of view being the Hilden. On arrival, Kain is met by the Sarafan Lord, and Kain boasts of laying waste to the Lord's plan, much like the Hilden had done at the top of the Sarafan Keep. The Lord tells him he's done nothing to stop what's coming, and how the Hilden, much like the vampires, are a race fallen from grace, mentioning the bit about the other dimension altering their visage. The Sarafan Lord says Kain's death is inevitable and strikes him with a Soul Reaver only for his blow to be repelled, much to his surprise. It's then he notices the Nexus stone, and Kain takes some pleasure in boasting how the tables have turned now, before the Sarafan Lord vanishes. Kain, with advice from the locals, learns where the shield is being generated from and travels there, fighting a mini-boss and bringing down the barrier, at which point the vampire army can teleport in, and their forces consist of Janos and Vordor, no one else. Vordor mentions through the whisper before they arrive how he looks forward to thanking Kain for saving Uma's life, probably having heard from her when she took the Nexus stone and got her butt handed to her by the Sarafan Knights. The two other vampires manifest and Vordor asks where Uma is, that he can't sense her. Kain tells him she won't be joining them, and Vordor understands she's dead and wants to know if Kain was too late to save her. And without missing a beat, he says no, she got what was coming to her for taking the Nexus stone. Vordor assumes this means he just didn't help her, but no, Kain gives it to him straight, that he killed her for her treachery. Vorador is outraged, even calling Kain a monster, but Kain tells him he would have done the same to any human or vampire who crossed him. I don't know about vampires, but humans, yeah, Vorador would not have hesitated ever to wipe out any human from the map if they got on his bad side. So Kain has a point. Kain continues and says he doesn't care if she acted on her own or was simply acting on Vorador's orders that what's done is done. When Vorador snaps at him and says they should never have trusted Kain, our protagonist utters the most curious of threats.
Do you so wish to return to the grave, old friend?
The only reference in the entire script to the fact that Vorador was brought back. To add insult to injury, Kain tells Vorador he's in no position to challenge him. And this part I do question, because again, not that much time has passed, chronologically speaking. Maybe the matter of a couple of days. Surely Vorador is much more powerful than Kain, even considering Kain has just consumed a few vampires along the way. Janos interrupts them and says there's no time for this conflict, that he feels the Hilden Gate is near, and he can teleport them there. Kain tells Vorador they'll settle the matter at a later date. At this night, the one to die will be the Sarafan Lord, and maybe this guy is like Beetlejuice. Say his name a few times and he pops up. As out of nowhere, he appears and RKOs Vorador and Janos with a few Soul Reaver bolts and teleports away. And again, they're very fortunate that these blasts don't outright kill like a slash from the blade would do. Which begs the question, why would the Sarafan Lord not strike them down considering he has the element of surprise? Seems a bit inconsistent with his entire plan of wiping the vampires from the map. Why disable when killing is just as easy? Janos stays behind with Vorador, who's been gravely injured, but teleports Kain close to the gate, instructing him to throw the Nexus stone into the gate where its powers will cause the Hilden Gate to collapse. And there it is, the thing that's meant to open portals is going to be used to close a portal. Okay. Kain proceeds to the gate building and a lift lowers him to a series of catwalks in a green glowing space filled with smoke, clouds, and floating rocks. The Hilden Gate itself. He confronts the Sarafan Lord and tells him to jump into the gate and return to his people before Kain blows up the gate, or to stay and die in the rubble. The Sarafan Lord, here at the end, recognizes Kain as a worthy adversary, but the vampire simply repeats the choice, exile or death. The Sarafan Lord wonders if Kain really thinks this is how it'll end, with just the Hilden, asking if Kain has ever considered why so many vampires joined up with the Sarafan. But Kain is not interested in the actions of cowards and traitors, only that they're removed. The Sarafan Lord continues and tells Kain that maybe they all recognize the Hilden cause as the just and righteous one, instead of the ambitions of a petty noble who simply gained too much power but never enough to satisfy his ambitions. And that's a lot of talk of righteousness and justice from a guy whose plan A was to eradicate every other species from the map. But in any case, Kain snaps at him and tells him his need to corrupt is the only thing clear, but that every single one of the people the Sarafan Lord turned against Kain are dead, including Uma, his latest spy, to which the Sarafan Lord says he doesn't have any spy called Uma. But Kain doesn't let him finish, shouts "Ve Victus," and the boss fight starts. And yeah, that line about Uma comes out of nowhere. There is zero indication in any moment that might even suggest that Uma was working for the Sarafan Lord. My guess is that it's a remnant from a cut storyline, and more reasons to believe Blood Omen 2 could have used the services of a skilled proofreader. And yes, a story about a traitor in the Cabal would have made things far more interesting. Speaking of interesting, the final boss fight starts out that way. The Sarafan Lord blasts you with Soul Reaver force projectiles, and if you manage to approach, he teleports to another end of the square catwalk arena. Telekinesis can stun him, but even so, running to him is not an option, leaving only one choice: to use the leap to tackle him off the platform. Do that once and the phase ends. In another cutscene, the Sarafan Lord says they're at a stalemate. The Hilden can't use the Soul Reaver's power against Kain because of the Nexus Stone, but as long as the Nexus Stone is being used for defense, it can't be used to close the gate. So Kain drops the stone into the portal and phase 2 starts, and this is just like every other fight in the game. Block, 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 dodge, unblockable, inward offensive Dark Gift. And for all of the power of the Soul Reaver, Kain can easily block it with his armored bracers, like he's Wonder Woman. When the boss is down to about 25% health, another cutscene plays in which the Sarafan Lord drops the Soul Reaver and Janos joins the fray. The two members of the ancient races curse at one another, Janos furious of his centuries of imprisonment to feed the mass, with the Sarafan Lord boasting, asking, rhetorically of course, what better way to take the revenge and his freedom from the same source, and that eons of suffering are too good for the vampire. Janos seems outraged and disgusted at the notion of the Hilden returning to Nosgoth after their banishment, so he demands the Sarafan Lord and his people to return where they were sent. To this, the Hilden Lord demands to know what gave the vampires the right to banish them. And Janos counters with his own question: who gave the Hilden the right to put the blood curse on vampires? The Sarafan Lord said it was justice for exiling them to that other place that has transformed them into this new appearance. Janos instead sees it as them just taking on their true form. For the record, because it needs to be said, neither of them is right in this. The vampires are not innocent, nor are the Hilden. But it was the vampires who started the war, simply because the Hilden did not agree with the worship of the Wheel of Fate and the cycle of death and rebirth and the Elder God. The Hilden's actions in this time period are not good, and the device's creation meant that even from ancient times, they had the means to eradicate all other life on Nosgoth, and likely would have used it. But it has to be said, they didn't cast the first stone. For Kain and the audience's point of view, especially anyone who's played the other games, this confrontation is merely the ravings of two zealots, both too blind to see their parts they've played in the conflict and the misery it brings. Janos uses tackle on the Sarafan Lord, and it's not very effective, for the Hilden grabs him by the throat and tosses him into the portal. He turns to face Kain, but at that point the catwalk starts to collapse, the heaving of the portal destroying it, so they both leap on the lift that brought Kain to this place and continue their fight there. Only now Kain is wielding the Reaver. And if you thought this changes the combat in any way, you're quite the optimist. It's exactly the same, only now you're holding the Soul Reaver. In the end, Kain defeats the Sarafan Lord, on the floor, too weak to move. The Hilden tells Kain that he's won the battle, but the war between their species will never end. That the demon world not only altered the Hilden's appearance, but also granted them immortality, so someday they will return. And that's pretty convenient, given that the Hilden also cursed the vampires with immortality. Kain tells him that if they ever return from that other world, he will be there waiting for them. The Sarafan Lord scoffs and claims Kain will not live that long, to which Kain retorts that he's lived long enough to dispose of the Sarafan Lord as he drives the Soul Reaver into his chest, consuming the soul of the Hilden and destroying him for good. In the epilogue, Kain finds himself melancholic instead of joyous in his victory, thinking back to what Uma said when she stole the stone. The question of how would his rule differ from that of the Sarafan. He ultimately says if she had lived, she would have learned the difference and that she should have trusted him. Walking away as we see the Sarafan being pulled from Nosgoth. Kain's last words are to the task at hand, to destroy the Sarafan remnants now finding themselves without leadership, and then rebuild for the beginning of a new rule, his rule. I have said it before, I don't like this game, but this epilogue is, at the very least, better than the cut one, which focused far more on Uma, and Kain's thoughts on the other vampire, with even more of a contemplative tone, which, again, the game doesn't earn with its narrative and characterization. Everything and everyone are thoroughly underdeveloped in Blood Omen 2. I do think I need to apologize for how distinctly negative this retrospective is, compared to the more balanced or nuanced approach I've had to the other videos. But if I am to be honest and thorough in my analysis and thoughts, there are simply too many things that Blood Omen 2 does poorly. But I do want to point out again that the circumstances of its development did not help the game be all that it could be. But that does leave us with one more game to look at, the final game in the main series, and a title that very much attempted to make all the pieces fit together with mixed success. Legacy of Kain: Defiance. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you on the next one.